Part 1. Who was Ragnar Lothbrok? For more than 1,000 years, one Viking has stood above all the others, Ragnar Lothbrok. His name appears in Norse sagas, medieval chronicles, and modern movies and television. But despite his fame, historians still cannot answer one simple question. Did Ragnar Lothbrok really exist? Some believe he was a fearless Viking king who led legendary raids across England and France. Others think he was never a single person at all, but a legendary hero created from the stories of several great Viking leaders. The truth lies somewhere between history and myth. To understand Ragnar, we first need to understand the world he lived in. The Viking Age began in the late 8th century, when the people of Scandinavia started sailing far beyond their homeland. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were divided into many small kingdoms, and life was often difficult. Good farmland was limited, winters were long, and ambitious young men looked for wealth and opportunity beyond the sea. Their greatest advantage was the longship, fast, light, and able to travel across oceans or shallow rivers. These ships allowed Vikings to strike without warning. They raided monasteries, traded with distant kingdoms, explored new lands, and established settlements from England to the Mediterranean. But the Vikings were more than raiders. They were skilled sailors, traders, craftsmen, and explorers. Their society valued courage, loyalty, and honor above everything else. A warrior who died bravely believed he might be welcomed into Valhalla, where he would feast beside the gods until the final battle of Ragnarok. Stories also played an important role in Viking culture. Before history was written down, poets passed tales from one generation to the next. Over time, real events mixed with legend, making it difficult to separate fact from fiction. This is exactly what happened with Ragnar Lothbrok. No contemporary Viking record clearly proves that he existed, yet his name appears in several medieval sources, written centuries later. Some historians believe Ragnar was based on one real Viking leader. Others think he represents the achievements of several famous warriors, combined into a single legendary hero. Whatever the truth may be, Ragnar's story shaped Viking history like few others. His adventures inspired generations, his name became known across Europe, and the men said to be his sons would change the course of English history forever. But before Ragnar became a legend, there was a question that still divides historians today. Who was the real Ragnar Lothbrok? Part 2. Was Ragnar Lothbrok a real person? The biggest mystery surrounding Ragnar Lothbrok is not how he lived, but whether he lived at all. Unlike many famous rulers of the Middle Ages, there are no documents written during Ragnar's lifetime that clearly mention him. Most of what we know comes from Icelandic sagas written nearly 300 years after the events they describe. These stories are filled with heroic battles, impossible victories, and mythical creatures, making them unreliable as historical evidence. However, that does not mean Ragnar was completely fictional. Several medieval chronicles written in England and France describe Viking leaders whose actions closely resemble those later attributed to Ragnar. One of the most famous was a Viking commander who attacked Paris in 845. According to Frankish records, this leader sailed up the Seine River with around 120 ships and forced the king of West Francia to pay a huge ransom to save the city. The chronicles call him Regin Harris, a name many historians believe could refer to Ragnar or have inspired the later legend. Other records describe powerful Viking warlords who raided England during the same period. Over time, storytellers may have combined these different men into a single legendary hero whose exploits became greater with every generation. The Norse themselves preferred memorable stories over precise history. Their goal was not to record every detail, but to preserve the courage, honor and achievements of their greatest warriors. As these stories were passed from one generation to the next, facts slowly blended with imagination. This is why historians remain divided today. Some believe Ragnar was a real Viking chief whose life became heavily exaggerated. Others argue that he never existed as one individual, and instead represents several famous raiders remembered under a single name. Although the debate continues, one fact is impossible to ignore. By the 9th century, Ragnar Lothbrok had already become one of the most famous names in the Viking world, and whether he was one man or many, the stories about him inspired thousands of warriors to seek glory across Europe. The legend was only beginning. The greatest raids of Ragnar were still to come. Part 3. Ragnar's Greatest Raids. Whether Ragnar was one man, or the combination of several Viking leaders, every version of his story shares one thing in common: his incredible raids across Europe. The first stories place Ragnar on the coasts of England, where Viking warriors targeted wealthy monasteries and small towns. These places held gold, silver, and valuable religious treasures, but were often protected by only a handful of defenders. Fast Viking ships appeared without warning, and before local armies could respond, the raiders had already disappeared back into the sea. As Ragnar's reputation grew, so did his ambitions. Instead of attacking isolated villages, he began leading larger fleets against powerful kingdoms. According to the Norse sagas, every successful raid brought him more wealth, more loyal warriors, and greater influence among the Viking chieftains. One of the most famous episodes connected to Ragnar is the attack on Paris in 845 AD. At the time, Paris was one of the richest cities in Western Europe. Protected by walls and defended by the Frankish kingdom, it seemed almost impossible to conquer. Yet a Viking fleet sailed up the Seine River, catching the kingdom by surprise. Medieval records describe around 120 ships carrying thousands of warriors. The Vikings defeated the Frankish forces outside the city and advanced toward Paris itself. Rather than risk the city's destruction, King Charles the Bald agreed to pay an enormous ransom of roughly 7,000 pounds of silver and gold for the Vikings to leave. Although the chronicles identify the Viking leader as Ragnar, many historians believe this figure may have inspired the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok. Whether it was truly him or another Viking commander, the attack became one of the most famous raids of the entire Viking Age. But Paris was only one chapter. The legends claim Ragnar continued sailing across England and the Frankish kingdoms, striking wherever wealth could be found. His victories turned him into a symbol of Viking courage and ambition. To many young warriors, joining Ragnar's fleet meant a chance to earn fortune, honor, and a place in history. Over time, every successful expedition made his legend even larger. Some stories likely exaggerated his achievements, while others may have combined the victories of different Viking leaders into a single name. Yet one thing remained unchanged. Across Europe, people began to fear the arrival of dragon-headed ships on the horizon. Because where the Vikings landed, kingdoms trembled. But according to legend, even the greatest warrior cannot escape fate. And Ragnar's final journey would become the most famous story ever told about him. Part 4. The Death of Ragnar Lothbrok. No part of Ragnar's story is more famous than his death. According to the Norse sagas, after years of successful raids, Ragnar decided to invade England once again. But this expedition was very different from the others. Some stories claim he sailed with only a few ships, believing his experience alone would bring victory. Others say a violent storm destroyed much of his fleet before he even reached the English coast. Whatever the reason, Ragnar's luck finally ran out. After landing in the kingdom of Northumbria, his small force was defeated by the army of King Yella. Ragnar was captured alive and brought before the king. What happened next became one of the most legendary scenes in Viking history. Instead of executing Ragnar with a sword, the sagas claim King Ella ordered him to be thrown into a deep pit filled with venomous snakes. Surrounded by deadly serpents, Ragnar faced death without begging for mercy. Even in his final moments, he refused to show fear. The stories say he laughed and declared that his sons would one day avenge him. According to the legend, his last words warned King Illa that the wolves he had raised would soon return. Whether Ragnar actually spoke these words is impossible to know. In fact, many historians doubt the entire story. There is no reliable contemporary source confirming that Ragnar died in a snake pit. Some researchers believe he may have died during battle, while others suggest he was simply another Viking leader whose death later became surrounded by myth. The snake pit itself may have been a symbolic invention created to make the story more dramatic and memorable. But regardless of what truly happened, the legend spread across Scandinavia. For generations, Ragnar's death became the perfect example of Viking courage. Even when facing certain death, the hero never surrendered, never pleaded for his life, and never abandoned his honor. Whether history or fiction, it became one of the greatest legends of the Viking Age. And according to the sagas, Ragnar's death did not mark the end of his story. It was only the beginning of his immortality.